A British nurse has been sentenced to life in prison for murdering 7 babies in her care. Lucy Letby was also found guilty of attempting to murder 6 others at the neonatal hospital unit where she worked. Letby refused to leave her cell for the sentencing. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says he wants to change the laws to stop this from happening again.
I think it's cowardly that people who commit such horrendous crimes do not face their victims and hear firsthand the impact that their crimes have had on them and their families and loved ones. Now, we are looking and have been at changing the law to make sure that that happens, and that's something that we'll bring forward in due course.
Sonia Gallego's got the latest from London.
There have only been 3 other women who've been handed down a whole life order. Murderers who are deemed so dangerous that the possibility of being released from prison was deemed too dangerous. Now Lucy Letby joins their ranks for the killing of 7 babies at a neonatal unit in the Countess of Chester Hospital, as well as the attempted killing of 6 others. Now, while she did not turn up to hear her sentencing in court today, the judge addressed the court and her directly as if she were there, stating that it was premeditation, calculation and cunning in your actions. Now, there were also present some dozen relatives of the victims as well, giving statements detailing the enormous distress that these families suffered. Also, what is being called into question is why did the hospital leave it so late for these deaths to be investigated? There was indeed quite a bit of contrast between how the consultants were warning the executives of the hospital of the issue, yet the executives of the hospital launched 2 inquiries initially which failed to include any forensic testing. When eventually police were called in and investigators were looked at, that's when it became obvious of the extent of Letby's input into this. Nevertheless, there are serious questions being asked and an inquiry is being put into place, but there are also calls for those executives of the hospital to be compelled to give evidence of why they left it so late to call the inquiry in. Sonia Gallego, Al-Jazeera, London.
Joseph Kotrie-Monson is the director of criminal law firm Mary Monson Solicitors, who specialises in infant death and serious injury cases. He's joining us now from Manchester. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Is this as simple as a breakdown in communication between medical staff and managers?
Absolutely not. These Letby murders and the fact that the later murders were almost actively allowed by hospital management staff against the express wishes to retain Letby in a patient-facing role have resulted in further deaths beyond the point at which they had raised the alarm. And in fact, this was 7 consultants who were overridden by management staff at the NHS, serious company men and women, not clinicians. This points, in my view, Rob, and the view of many people around, and this is why a full public inquiry, judge-led, is necessary, not a government talking shop in which there's a mediation rather than real force in the inquiry. But this is why the questions as to whether there is a systemic problem in the way in which the NHS responsibility for patient care is managed with overriding authority by almost commercial managers who are motivated by targets and under political pressure, under fear from press with regard to whether they are hitting those statistics, or the doctors, world-class paediatricians in this case, who on multiple occasions raised the alarm and said on some occasions, it is Letby, can possibly be ignored. There is a systemic problem here. It must be addressed. It can only be addressed as justice must be addressed in public with proper sweeping powers to compel witnesses and demand evidence. At the moment, what the UK government is proposing, perhaps for fear of its own embarrassment, falls far short of that.
It comes down to accountability, does it? But it also comes down to the difference in corporate view, if you like, in terms of the way that the administrators and the priorities that they have and the medical staff who are working on a day-to-day basis. This must, of course, be worrying and being watched very closely by the managers of hospitals all around the world. How do you manage to bring both sides together when, going by what you're saying, the managers and the medical staff have two almost completely divergent views of what should be happening?
Well, that's interesting, Rob. You've really hit the nail on the head, if you don't mind me saying. Accountability is where it starts. Look at these individuals. Look at this man, Harvey, who on multiple occasions not only refused anything but the most cursory investigation into the ongoing deaths. For personal responsibility, we have laws on manslaughter in the UK that should be investigated against in respect of anybody. I'm not saying this individual is guilty. What I am saying is that this is the worst set of homicides against children in 50 years in this jurisdiction. It should be looked at very, very, very carefully. And also the hospital itself. But there are structural problems here. And when hospitals, our public services, are run as businesses instead of by the experts who are accountable, but by the trained medical experts, with them having authority over something as sacred as patient care, then we have a problem. And it's time to look very carefully at ourselves, as all organizations such as these must do worldwide.
We heard Prime Minister Rishi Sunak saying that, responding to this, and his response was geared towards the fact that Letby did not face her accusers, face the prosecution and the families of the victims in court. That was his priority. Does that concern you, that that seems to be his focus, rather than perhaps going for the wider reaching investigations and structures that you were talking about earlier on?
I think for people, it's tremendously frustrating when somebody isn't present at the moment that families of their victims, apparently of that person's victims, apparently chosen by them indiscriminately, lack that last piece of the puzzle in terms of the legal process, and justice to some small extent is denied them. Although justice is a very blunt instrument when it comes to the ripping apart from you of your child. Having said that, practicalities of what might actually happen. This is a dead end legally. What do? Compel somebody physically to attend, and then they disrupt proceedings by screaming and shouting. That doesn't provide dignity. You can't sentence them to longer if they're going to prison already for the end of their natural life. I have to say cynically and without prejudice as to my extreme sympathy for the part of the day in the presence of Lucy Letby that families of the victims have had stolen from them, with extreme sympathy for that. Nevertheless, I think that it's a nice distraction for Rishi Sunak to seize upon, because the wider questions reflect poorly on a government that has constructed and maintained an NHS where doctors have been allowed to be ignored as the most vulnerable patients in their care, and with their knowledge have died.
Joseph Kotrie-Monson, we appreciate you being with us on Al-Jazeera, so thank you very much indeed for your time.